Naka-mute.
Everyone. My name is Armand. I'll be the MC for today. We'll be joined later as the moderator, by Dr. Jenny Lynn Elmaco. To give our opening remarks, please welcome the Director of the UP Law Center's Institute for the Administration of Justice, Professor Gwen Grecia de Vera.
Maraming salamat, Attorney Arevalo. Dr. Jenny Lind Elmaco, Miss Inday Sahor, Dr. Maria Lourdes Veneracion, Prof. Salma Rasul, Senator Rasul, and I'd also like to acknowledge the attendees from various organizations for this community, OPA PRU, NCMF, of course, the Commission on Human Rights, the Swiss Embassy, NAMFREL with Serlito, ICRC, UPAC, UNWEP, the Austrian Embassy, UNHCR, the Canadian Embassy, and the Bangsamoro Liaison Office in Manila. Maraming salamat po for joining us for this morning's forum. So for the members of our academic community, guests, colleagues, and friends, magandang umaga po at isang maalab na pagbati. It is an honor to welcome you to the Forum on Women, Transitional Justice, and the Pursuit of Peace. Of course, we all know that in 2000, the United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325 was adopted, recognizing the shifting landscape of conflict and warfare and its devastating effects, particularly on women and girls, and the role of women in prevention and peace building. Since its adoption, member states have implemented the resolution's pillars in the development of their respective national action plans. In 2010, the Philippine government adopted its first national action plan on women, peace, and security, becoming the first country in Asia to adopt a national policy that makes operational its commitment. Today's forum, a very timely and urgent one, has been organized in celebration of the anniversary of the UNSCR 1325 on October 31. It aims to shed light on the progress, challenges, and the ways forward in advancing the Women, Peace, and Security agenda in the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, or BARM, while also underscoring the importance of the pursuit of transitional justice in these efforts. I anticipate a robust and reflective discussion led by the forum's esteemed speakers and experts that explores with urgency women's meaningful and impactful participation in transitional justice as an imperative to sustainable peace. And on this note, I wish to extend our deep thanks to our forum resource persons for their time and what I am certain will be invaluable contributions to the discussion, and congratulate the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy on organizing our forum today. I wish everyone a fruitful morning and again extend our deepest thanks for your presence today. Magandang umaga po muli.
Thank you, Professor De Vera. Before we turn over and go to the moderated discussion, I'd just like to introduce our moderator as well as our experts for today. Our moderator is Dr. Jenilyn Elmaco, an awardee of the Global Exemplary Education Double Gold Award and the Global Exemplary Innovative Leadership Diamond Award from the Global Women Inventors and Innovators Network, UK. Also, the Marie Curie Social Impact Award and Fellow of the Royal Society of the Arts. Alumna of the prestigious Marie Skłodowska-Curie Fellowship for the Center of Excellence in Sustainable Peace Building, and recipient of the Erasmus Mundus Global Studies Fellowship, as well as other recognitions. She is a national contact point of the MSCA, the European Research Council and Research Infrastructures, and regional coordinator of the EURA-XESS. She has extensive experience in international development, strategic partnerships, research, and innovation across continents. She has worked with international organizations such as the AECID, the ADB, the UN, etc. Our next expert is Ms. Indal Zahor. I hope I pronounced that properly. Has over 30 years working as a gender humanitarian advisor in countries in situations of war and armed conflicts in Asia Pacific, Africa, and the Middle East, in different capacities with UN agencies. INGOs, especially in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Sudan, as a gender humanitarian advisor. She recently returned from Papua New Guinea, where she trained tribal leaders and chieftains, local councillors, policemen, and women leaders, resulting in the setting up of the Highlands Women Peace and Security Localization Steering Committee. She was awarded the Rockefeller Fellow on Human Security at the City University of New York and the Dame Anita Barrow Award by the University of Toronto and the Gender Justice Award by the Women's Initiative for Gender Justice. A visiting professor at the UN University for Peace in Costa Rica, teaching gender and peace building for 6 years, and was part of the team that developed the master's program. She served as convener of the internationally recognized Women's International War Crimes Tribunal on Japan's military sexual slavery, an international law landmark initiative that recognized rape and sexual slavery as a crime against humanity. She was deployed in 2020 to Syria as a gender humanitarian advisor to the Office of the UN Resident Coordinator for the whole of Syria response. We also have Dr. Maria Lourdes Veneracion, an associate professor at the Department of Political Science of the Ateneo de Manila University. As a feminist political scientist, she teaches graduate and undergraduate courses on gender and transitional justice, women's human rights, women, peace, and security. For several years, she has handled classes under the Ateneo de Manila University for Peace, Costa Rica Asian Peace Builders Scholars Program, and the Ateneo Law School Mahidol University Master in Human Rights and Democratization Program. Associate Professor Veneracion is currently the director of the Asia Pacific Center for the Responsibility to Protect Philippine Office, based at the Ateneo de Manila University. Additionally, she is the vice president of the Philippine Political Science Association. Previously, she had served as consultant on the National Action Plan on Women, Peace, and Security for the Office of the Presidential Advisor on the Peace Process, as well as senior gender advisor to the Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission for the Bangsamoro. On various occasions, he had served as consultant and senior technical expert and advisor to institutions such as the UN Women, ASEAN Intergovernmental Commission on Human Rights, Department of Foreign Affairs, the Regional Commission on Bangsamoro Women, and the Women Engaged in Action on United Nations Security Council Resolution 1325. Our next expert is Dr. Mark Anthony Torres, a committed peace builder with a profound dedication to the fields of education, conflict transformation, and community development. Notably, Dr. Torres has made significant contributions as a facilitator in the listening sessions of the Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission. He has earned well-deserved recognition for his remarkable contributions to peace building. In 2021, he was honored with the Golden Laurel Award for Children's Rights in acknowledgement of his tireless efforts in promoting peace and human rights. In 2017, he received the prestigious title of the Outstanding Young Man for his unwavering commitment to education and government service. In 2016, he was also recognized as one of Metrobank Foundation's outstanding teachers. Dr. Torres also holds key leadership positions. He is serving as director of the School of Interdisciplinary Studies and the director of the Institute for Peace and Development in Mindanao at MSU Iligan Institute of Technology. He actively contributes to the cause of peace as a board member of the Mindanao Peace Building Institute and the Pailig Development Foundation, Inc. His former roles and extensive experience reflect his dedication to promoting peace and development in the Mindanao region. Our last, certainly not the least, expert is Attorney Anwar Malang, a former government official of ARM who acted as a regional secretary of DILG and DTI. He ran and served as a 3-term Cotabato City Councilor. In his last term at the City Council, he also served as a chairman of the Philippines Councilors League, Region 12. Along these years, he was serving as human rights lawyer for disadvantaged groups and worked with various civil society groups and as a consultant of several NGOs in order to advance the welfare of the disadvantaged populace of the city and the region in general. He is the founding chairman of Mindanao Human Rights Action Center. Attorney Malang also participated in the Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission consultation process. Now in the private sector, he is active on civic organizations such as the Rotary Club and the local Red Cross chapter. May we now call on Dr. Jenlyn Del Maco.
Thank you very much. May I invite our speakers, panelists here in front, please. Ms. Inday Sahor, Senior Gender Advisor for Humanitarian and Emergency Response for Refugee Council. Dr. Maria Lourdes Veneracion, Associate Professor, Ateneo de Manila University, Department of Political Science. And Dr. Mark Anthony Torres is joining us online. And Attorney Anwar Malang, former Regional Secretary, Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, Department of Interior and Local Governance. He's also on. I seem to have a problem with my mic. You can hear me? Okay, perfect. So I am deviating a little bit with the program because this person definitely needs to be in the panel, especially as she just came from a big win for the Philippines. When it comes to women, peace and security, she just won the Intercultural IAA Achievement Award of the Austrian Embassy for her podcast, She Talks Peace. And you know her as the president of the Philippine Center for Islam and Democracy, also a member of the Board of Regents of Mindanao State University. So as a leading Muslim leader, and of course, in many respects, like somebody that we really look up to, definitely needs a chair here. So please join us as well, Ms. Amina Rasul Bernardo. Thank you so much. So the Women, Peace and Security Agenda is a framework developed by the United Nations to promote the participation of women in conflict prevention, resolution, and peace-building processes, as well as to address the specific needs and rights of women in conflict-affected areas. This agenda recognizes that women are often disproportionately affected by conflict and yet play a crucial role in building and maintaining peace. Certainly, there are several examples from different countries where transitional justice processes have included the active participation of women. And these examples illustrate how women have contributed to post-conflict reconciliation, to accountability, and the promotion of gender-sensitive approaches. And let me mention some of them as we are connecting to the global stage as well with the examples that has been presented and also experienced and led by our esteemed panel here. Of course, we remember the South Africa Truth and Reconciliation Commission, which was established after the end of apartheid. I was just in Johannesburg some weeks ago, and we had a nice discussion about not only about women survivors, but about these activists and leaders involved in providing testimony, sharing their experiences, and of course, advocating for justice and reparations. Connecting again to Africa, we have the Liberia Women's Peace Movement. And during the Liberian Civil War, women played a crucial role in advocating for peace and security. You have heard about the Liberia Mass Action for Peace, led by women like Lema Gibowi. I hope I pronounced her name right, and forgive me if I'm doing that wrong. And of course, we know former President Ellen Johnson Sirleaf actively engaged in negotiations and the peace processes. And of course, you know her as the first female president of Liberia. Let's bring it to Latin America. We have the experience of Colombia with the inclusion of women in peace processes. So during the peace negotiations between the government and the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or the FARC, women's organizations were actively participating also in the peace process. Let's bring it a little bit to the center with Bosnia and Herzegovina, where there is women's advocacy for justice. Women's groups in Bosnia and Herzegovina also played a vital role in advocating for the prosecution of war crimes committed during the Balkan conflicts. And then closer to home, to Nepal, we have women's engagement in peace building in the aftermath of Nepal's civil conflict. Women were also actively involved in peace building and reconciliation efforts, and there are many more stories. Of course, today, as we commemorate the 23rd anniversary of the UNSCR 1325, we shall talk about the pivotal role of women in transitional justice, and its profound relevance to peace and security in our very own Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao. In the backdrop of post-conflict societies like BARM, we confront intricate challenges, yet we also bear witness to the extraordinary pursuit of gender-inclusive transitional justice. So BARM, with its unique historical and cultural tapestry, carries the indelible scars of prolonged conflict. However, amidst these adversities, the women of BARM have emerged as beacons of hope and agents of transformation, and they stand at the forefront in the pursuit of peace, justice, and stability, and making their mark as catalysts for positive change. So, the involvement of women in transitional justice processes is crucial, as we know, in the global stage, in different experiences of different countries, also here at home. But first, let me ask our panelists, first of all, what is transitional justice? And I'll start with you, Ms. Sahor, please.
Okay. Hi, good morning, everyone. Hi, Gwen. I'm really a pleasure to meet you. It's very hard to say what's transitional justice, but let me introduce myself a little bit. As most of you know, I also am a graduate of UP. I was here studying political science way back, and I won't tell you what year because then, I become a senior citizen. And, as a political science, my dream was really to become a lawyer. So I decided to go to law, but of course I decided to go against the law. You know what I mean? And this whole reminds me of those days that, during our activism days, and it really make a mark. We always say we were going to law, but we decided to go against the law, which was really the right path during that time. But anyway, as we are looking at now, I think the BARN historical initiative of looking at transitional justice, it's a very hard framework, because of the fact that the legal mechanism did not respond earlier to the violations done to the communities and to the women. So in a way, in the course of my work in different countries, in the course of my work in giving justice to the comfort women, I'm sure all of you know and you are familiar with the case of our lolas, the former comfort women. I was one of those who worked on that case, and I brought the case to Japan. You organized a war crimes tribunal. But before organizing the war crimes tribunal, we filed court cases in the Tokyo District Court on the war crimes committed against our lola. I would also like to mention, which I'll talk about later, on the significance of the Women's International War Crimes Tribunal that we organized. Dean Marlene Magallona, our former dean here, was actually the head prosecutor for the Philippines. But again, that's another story. So I will go back to the whole framing of what is transitional justice. Because as we are saying, the absence of the law and the justice mechanism to prosecute the crimes immediately after any massacres or mass rape that happened shows the failure of the law itself. And so in the aftermath of the crisis and in a relatively peaceful situation where in many occasions, whether we're comparing it to the BARN or to other countries who went into transition, we console ourselves with what we call transitional justice and reconciliation. Now, I will be very direct about it because I have worked in many countries, and transitional justice is a very emotional process, because of the fact that we have to recall and reestablish what happened during the massacres and the killings during the period of the armed conflict or the war itself. But at the same time, I think what is really important for us is to recognize that we should always use the law, the international law, humanitarian law, and the Geneva Protocol too, as a basis for all of this. Because transitional justice is about establishing the crime that was committed to the people from the start. You know, it's not about, you know, we have a saying, consuelo di bobo, di ba? Okay, we're going into reconciliation, this has happened. No, we have to really establish the fact of the crime. Because when you are saying no repetition of the violence, di ba, Gwen? When we say no repetition, it means you have to go back to the past, right, to establish the moment of those incidents and to really redefine what we mean by transitional justice, redefine what we mean by compensation, restitution, atonement, and reconciliation. And we have to redefine that in the context of gender, in the context of women. Because, you know, what happened in all the conflict that I had been, whether when I was in Afghanistan or Iraq or Somalia, in all those countries, it is the women who suffer most during the conflict. It is the women who suffer most during the war. But when it comes to transitional mechanism, the women are last to be recognized. Who took care of the family and the community during the conflict? It was the women. But what we do is we give, one more second, what we do is we give the acknowledgement to the men. We give the acknowledgement, and even in the disarmament, you know, period, we give compensation to the men who started the war in the first place. But the women who suffered during the war, we don't give them compensation and reparations. Yeah. So we need to reestablish and reconsider. As I was saying in my last talk at the National University in Singapore College of Law this year, I was saying you have to go into the fringes of international law and humanitarian law. We have to constantly challenge it because the law is not established as one. We have to constantly redefine it in the context of, you know, the sufferings of the people.
Thank you so much for that. That's a very strong start to our discussion. But talking about international and humanitarian law and the role of the international community, I'd like to welcome another panelist with us today. She's Vanessa Vianca Pagliarco, who currently serves as an independent, I have it, it's okay. As an independent consultant from the United Nations Women. She graduated also from the University of the Philippines in Manila in communication study and international studies. So she has been a part of also of the peace processes, and in many respects, I'd like to now welcome her here in this nice little seat. Thank you so much. And while she is getting herself comfortable, I'd like to continue the discussion. Ms. Sahor has given us a lot of things to think about, but I'd like to bring the men in the room, since that was one of the last sentences there. So Dr. Mark Anthony Torres, Attorney Anwar Mala, perhaps your thoughts on what Dr. Ms. Sahor has said about making sure that we look at and we revisit as well international humanitarian law. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Mark Anthony Torres from Mindanao State University Iligan Institute of Technology. I agree. With regards to transitional justice, it brings us a lot of processes and mechanisms to come to terms with the legacy of large-scale past abuses. And for me, this doesn't also only necessarily mean that we revisit the laws and policies, but also as a professor coming from Mindanao State University, this entails a lot of impacts to the education sector. Transitional justice for me, as what I observe, is very important for collective healing, reconciliation, and moving forward. And moving forward necessarily means that we have to also look back, and this entails a lot of discussions about international humanitarian law and others. However, in the case of the academe, we see a gap with regards to transitional justice mechanisms and how these are being integrated into our curriculum. That's what is important for me. I think Attorney Mala, if you can also add.
Yes, good morning to everyone. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wabarakatuh. I am Attorney Anwar Malang from Cotabato City, currently on the private sector now. I used to be with the government and, of course, with the human rights groups. The first speaker actually eloquently explained the meaning of transitional justice and some of the pillars of the transitional justice. So the most important thing is in transitional justice actually is the truth seeking, prosecution, reparation, and of course the institutional reforms of the agencies of the government. So I do not deal mostly on the meaning of the transitional justice. At this point in time, the most important thing for us is to uh, look into the goals of transitional justice, such as to promote peace, democracy, and reconciliation. So I think that's all from me.
If I may add,
Thank you.
if I may add still, no, we, based on our observation, we have laws, we have systems, we have mechanisms in place. However, what we see is that the challenge now is how these laws would have the authority, capacities, and these mechanisms have the resources to actively eliminate the horror inequalities and achieving de facto equality for women. So I think we have sometimes we're saying that many of our laws and policies are recommendatory in nature. Once you see them, observe how these laws are impacting our communities, it remains to be seen the impact of these laws and policies, especially those connected to transitional justice. Thank you very much.
That I'd like to stay on that, especially with the role of education, and bring it to you, Dr. Veneracion. Of course, you are with Ateneo de Manila University, but you're also very, very active as well in these processes, and also, of course, on women in security. In your experience, not only to define transitional justice, but where do you see it moving towards now?
All right, thank you very much. I would like to start by saying that just like Inday, I'm also a graduate of UP Political Science. Student number 87, I'll leave it there because I forgot the rest already. 87, 87. And one of the things probably that enticed me into political science is really try to understand what is war, why does it occur, but at the same time, being a feminist, even during that time, it was also converging with what are the things that women experience in that kind of a situation, like in wartime. Moving to transitional justice, we all know the academic definition. It has 5 pillars. You have the right to truth, right to justice, right to reparation, guarantee of non-recurrence, and right to memorialization. So in that sense, these things are very, very complex. And as Inday mentioned, it's really highly emotional because you're looking at atrocities that were committed in the past, okay? And the past means that it can be 50, 60, even 100 years. Crimes that are of massacres, mass atrocity crimes, whether it is genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, these crimes do not expire. Yeah. So, and it takes political will for a government to actually respond to transitional justice measures. In the Philippines, it was not called transitional justice, but we had transitional justice initiatives. Remember that transitional justice comes from the context of armed conflict situation and authoritarian regime. So these are the transition periods, the transition areas. The Philippines had both. Okay, so we had the experience of an authoritarian regime, we had an armed conflict situations, and during that time, the transition from the President Marcos Sr. to the government of Corazon Aquino, that was already a period of transitional justice. We had the 1987 Constitution. We had, under the 1987 Constitution, we had the longest human rights provision in the world during that particular time. We had the creation of the Commission on Human Rights. These are transitional justice measures. In the same manner, in the Bangsamoro, we had the legislation on the Bangsamoro Organic Law. And in that sense, the bringing or the creation of the Bangsamoro Autonomous Region in Muslim Mindanao, the establishment of the parliament, these are all transitional justice measures. However, they were not called as transitional justice. They were just there. Okay, especially during the 1987 period. We had the reparations law in 2013 that basically created the Human Rights Victims Claims Board, and right now the Human Rights Violations Victims Memorial Commission, or MEMCOM. The HRVCB took care of the reparations from, I think, for 2 years. There was 75,000 applicants, claimants that actually applied, but the ones who were given reparations, 11,103 only. Okay, so imagine that kind of a discrepancy, and in that light, you know, in light of reparation, did we actually repair anything? You know, a lot of people did not want the monetary reparations. You know, a lot of people now are doing commemorations and all of these things. But at the end of the day, did we heal? Did we reconcile? Did we actually address the root causes of the violence that actually happened? So moving to transitional justice and education, that is where it is, one of the spaces. But we shouldn't look at it only from the perspective of curriculum inclusion. There are so many things that we want to include in the curriculum. I mean, kawawa naman yung mga bata. We have been asking the children to study peace, human rights, whatever. You know, there's so many things, and none of it gets internalized because, you know, there are too many things going on. So it's not just in the educational system. It could also be in the informal spaces. It could be in community learning spaces. It could also be in in capacity building, progressive capacity building programs for various stakeholders, where it is government or civil society, etc. I mean, the Philippines, we don't really have to go far, because we have a lot of TJ-ables. That's what we call it, TJ-able issues. Okay? It's not just with regard to the Bangsamoro. You have the war on drugs, you have Marawi, you know, Zamboanga, so many things. But at the end of the day, do we really understand what transitional justice means, depending on our context? Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Before I continue, I see somebody in the room. Of course, all of you are important, but this person, definitely I have to mention, most especially, former Secretary Guingdeles, Presidential Advisor of the Peace Process. Thank you so much for joining us today. So let's continue. So Dr. Veneracion has talked about, has actually questioned: are we really healing? Are we reconciling? In your work, Amina, and has spanned decades, not to say your age, but really just your experience on this aspect. But what can you add to this point, please?
Sabi na nga, no mentioning of year for the. I wanted to frame it from a personal, from the personal side, because it's really great that you have frameworks and mechanisms, proposal for transitional justice mechanism in the Bangsamoro, but what does it mean to the victim? Next year, February 7, is the 50th year of the burning of Jolo. And I think that was the first major conflict, really, that showed the world that the Bangsamoro was a force against state, during the early days of martial law. During the burning of Holo, I was in college. Oh my God, I just said my... I was here in UP. 80% of the town was destroyed. Relatives were dispersed. So many of our of the people we knew from our hometown were killed. To this date, there has been no compensation for any of us who lost homes, who lost relatives. Marawi is in a better situation because immediately government attention was focused, because government has learned from experiences such as ours that you have to compensate the victims, although it's been 6 years and the compensation is slow in coming. In Marawi, if you look at the reparations, the rehabilitation, really nice government buildings, nice stadium, there's a beautiful cultural center, a huge mosque, but not a single home has been built. Is that compensation enough? Is this transitional justice in operation 50 years after the burning of Holo? So 50 years, no compensation, no apology, no recognition of the impact on families and institutions. Before the burning of Holo, we were relatively progressive. I always like to say that before the burning of Holo, we had more banks in Holo than in Camiguin. Our access to water within the household was better than Pampanga. Our access to electricity was better than Ilocos Sur, if you can believe that. Before martial law. After martial law, we were bottom. And we haven't really recovered. Every time you look at us in Sulu, you think, conflict affected, they'll never get out of the poverty. But we weren't there to begin with. This was something we suffered at the hands of our state, of our government. So if you're talking about transitional justice from the point of view, from the personal point of view of the victims, has state really done enough to recognize the victims, to recognize the plight of the women who really suffered, to look for their families, to scrounge for food, to provide their children? Or is it okay just to have the mechanism but not really look at the actual compensation, reparation, rehabilitation of the victims? For me, if we're going to have real transitional justice, you have to continue with the truth-telling, the recognition of what was done to us, and no papering over what was done to us. Because if you don't realize what the truth is, there can be no healing. And then compensation, and then work on the mechanisms so that you can institutionalize reforms within the system so that we can really have transitional justice. Yeah. I hope, Ging, you agree, we agree with that.
Thank you so much for that. And I know we can unpack a lot of things from your experience, Amina, but at this point, I'd like to expand this discussion and bring together the United Nations, especially as the UN just signed a new cooperation framework with the government of the Philippines just, I think, some days ago. Perhaps, Vanessa, you can discuss to us about where, most especially where transitional justice is, or the women, peace and security in this new framework of cooperation.
Good morning. Assalamualaikum. Yun po. So, I'd like to also build on what the other panelists had mentioned. I think one of the, if I may add to Prof. Venez's earlier manifestation, one of the brewing narratives at the moment is also generating the interest of the youth in the narratives of transitional justice, because I think that's also an important element to include, that while there are a lot of narratives that we hear from the more experienced generation, the intergenerational dialogue is important to also preserve this narrative so that the younger generation who were not able to experience firsthand these kinds of narratives are able to also understand. So I think what Prof. Bene had mentioned about embedding it also in the informal education, in the trainings. I think our colleagues from OPAP has also been doing a lot of capacity building interventions, particularly on conflict sensitive and peace promoting approaches, wherein part of the curriculum is also to include transitional justice in the topics. So that's more targeted to the duty bearers like the government offices and other organizations supporting the peace process. Meanwhile, in terms of what the UN has been also doing in support of the transitional justice, for UN Women, recently there's also a ramped up support towards the crafting of the Bangsamoro Regional Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security. So previously, the national document, which served as the blueprint of the UNSCR 1325, explicitly articulates transitional justice. And so that's the time also of Prof. Bene and, of course, Secretary Guingdeles when she's with OPAP. So those were part of the national document. So fast forward to 2023 to 2028, what we want to highlight is the commitment now of the Bangsamoro Regional Government, which is also a result of a multi-stakeholder process, is an explicit articulation action point that delves into the operationalization of the transitional justice, particularly focusing on the gender component. So that's under the Bangsamoro Women Commission and the Bangsamoro Human Rights Commission. So of course, that's just one part of the narrative. We know that the other areas also have TJ-related issues. So UN Women has also been supporting the updating of the National Action Plan on Women, Peace and Security for 2023 to 2033. It's going to be a 10-year plan, which also incorporates the transitional justice as part of priority action points, particularly in support of the different peace processes, like the Bangsamoro peace processes, and also the ongoing efforts towards the very complex document on the National Task Force to end the local communist armed conflict. And I know that this is really a very lengthy narrative, but I think one important thing to highlight is that, of course, the UN agencies are tied up to the framework, and of course, the whole of UN approach is also something that we bank on, so that all the UN agencies will be able to contribute to one specific agenda. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that, Ms. Palyarco. I have a question. Actually, this is coming from Amina, and I'm sure it's directed to Ms. Sahor and Dr. Veneracion, although the others can also jump in. To your knowledge, Ms. Sahor and Dr. Veneracion, were the recommendations outlined in the report of the Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission adopted or implemented by the concerned agencies or institutions? And the second question, and perhaps our men panelists can also join in. Can you say that there is political will to push for the attainment of transitional justice, most especially in Burma?
Benny, you go first.
Okay. The Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission, actually the former commissioner on the government side is actually here. Attorney Sedge Jimenez. She was the one who actually worked a lot also in crafting the Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission report in 2016. And this was the first time that transitional justice was actually ever been part of a peace process, and that was also during the time of Sec Ging. So out of the 96 recommendations that the TJRC actually had that were clustered into the right to know, the pillars of transitional justice, there has not been a a synchronized as well as a systematic effort to actually pursue them. The problem is when you're talking about the bureaucracy and you actually create mechanisms, the people there will only stay for a very, very short time. So, like for example, the government during the time of President Duterte created or passed an executive order that created the Inter-Cabinet Cluster on Normalization. And transitional justice is actually part of the normalization agreement between the Philippine government and the MILF. So with this particular structure, okay, it took time for membership to be identified. And then by the time that they were actually identified, the administration is done. So there has to be another set that you're going to, you know, train and that you're going to actually create the different things. So in other words, in terms of the national level government structure, it is not actually, it's not as active just yet. Okay? But the government and the MILF, they have a roadmap. A roadmap on transitional justice. Attorney Sedge was also a consultant who did the recommendations during that time. They have a roadmap, but until this time, it still unfortunately remains as a roadmap. So it has not actually moved beyond the roadmap framework. As what Amina was saying, there are a lot of frameworks that are actually existing. At the same time, at the BARM level, you could see individual leaders, women actually, who have been advancing transitional justice. Like for example, MP Attorney Liza Alamia, who is part actually of the mechanism on normalization and transitional justice. She has been filing resolutions as well as bills at the regional level on transitional justice. The BARM also has the Bangsamoro Human Rights Commission that has been mandated by law to be the transitional justice mechanism in the region. At the national level, there has been bills in Congress filed by Congressman Kit Belmonte and Ami Sangkopan refiled the bill. And at the Senate, something was filed also by Senator Risa Ontiveros. So all of these things are happening, but there is no single systematic synchronization of the initiatives. And at the same time, it seems that the recommendations of the TJRC was actually nowhere in sight. So parang you're not actually going back to the recommendation. What did they recommend to the Armed Forces of the Philippines? What did they recommend to the PNP, Philippine National Police? If the PNP was actually following the recommendations of the TJRC, then they would not have been involved in a lot of violence, in a lot of crimes done with impunity. You know, that was the whole point. So there has been just to summarize, there has been initiatives, there have been initiatives, but not directly related to saying that it's the operationalization of the TJRC recommendation, and they are not synchronized, they are not systematized. Thank you.
Please. Oh, okay. So there is a recommendation from Ms. Sahor to ask the men. So the men who are joining us virtually, what can you say about this this question as well? Perhaps Attorney Malang, we can start with you.
Yeah, in fairness to the government, actually, in the BOL, it provides there that the Bangsamoro Parliament should pass or enact a law that would provide for the mechanism for the implementation of transitional justice based on the TJ report. Unfortunately, up to now, we don't have that law. In fact, at least somehow man lang, in the present situation, the redo could be settled, redo based on land conflicts. I remember I had a discussion with them that we should have the Bangsamoro Land Commission. So it would be a concrete step on having a transitional justice. In fact, one of the reasons for the MILF, for instance, or the Bangsamoro fighting against the government at that time is the issue on that. But up to now, we don't have a system on reparation. I do hope that with the decommissioning, that would be one of the discussions of the OPA Pro, so that the MILF communities could be pacified also, could somehow feeling na there is a reparation for them. So those are the things. In fact, the government could have used the 5 billion special development fund for the establishment of that and for the manner of reparation for the Bangsamoro people. Yun po. Thank you.
Please.
If I can also contribute, the way I see it is that there have been discussions, laws, policies, recommendations. However, transitional justice also means a shift towards mental models. And the way I see it, even inside the academy within the Mindanao State University, there haven't been much change in terms of mental models. Now, how much people appreciate transitional justice, no, its concept and its real meaning. And this is the reason why we are learning from other countries. We have a program called the Southeast Asian University Partnership for Peace Building and Conflict Transformation with Battambang University in Cambodia, Timor-Leste, the UNPAS, and Marburg University from Germany. We're learning from this experience so that we can also mainstream this one to education. I'd like to say that, for example, in the communities that we're working on at the ground level with the Bangsamoro Islamic Women Auxiliary Brigade, we've asked them how many of them were able to participate or be beneficiaries of decommissioning processes. They would say from Lanao Sur, about only 25% of those who registered. From Maguindanao del Norte, about many more, 40 plus percent. Maguindanao del Sur, 20%. And they're saying, however, that in terms of reintegration assistance, only very few of them, no, they felt that these are very important for them, the reintegration assistance. But however, only 7% for Lanao Sur, 9%, and consequently 17% from Maguindanao del Sur are saying that this reintegration assistance have been accessible to them. And the way we see it is that not many of these processes or mechanisms are benefiting our communities, particularly the BWAB, is that because they're saying that they still have also problems with civilian registration, civilian documentation in the form of birth certificates. In a recent study that we have conducted, about 19% from Lanao del Sur are saying that they have problems. No? These are B1 from Lanao Sur. They're saying that they have problems with birth certification. And this also means that they have challenges to availing social services connected to TJ mechanism.
Thank you so much for that. Before I give you the room, Amina, I just would like to also acknowledge the presence of Attorney Cecilia Jimenez Damari, who is the UN Special Rapporteur on the human rights of internally displaced persons. I first met her in New York, and I see you in the room, so I had to say hello to you. Please, Amina.
Thank you, Jen. I just wanted to contextualize it further. Okay. When a community is washed away because of a tsunami, the people who were affected do not rise up in rebellion if there is no reparation or quick reparation. But if a community is eradicated because they were bombed by state, you can well imagine that the people affected are going to rise in anger against state, right? So tell me why, when the typhoons and the tsunamis happen in communities like Leyte, within a year, communities rise already. You've got businesses, you've got homes, the roads and bridges are rebuilt. But when you have armed conflict and, Marawi is, how many barangays razed to the ground? More than 6 years and you still don't see it happening. You see the women scrounging for their own capital so that they can, have some income to take care of their families. And it's not like they don't approach government. They do. But where is the assistance for these people in communities where you know the lure of violent extremism is strong? I assure you, if there's a typhoon and the banks of the Marikina River will flood that area, within a month, you're going to have tons of assistance for that community. But why is it that we don't have such an immediate response for areas of conflict? And that it's not like we don't have mechanisms or we don't have frameworks. We do. But where is the political will from the national all the way down to regional? I think it's great that we re-examine the institutions and the law and government circulars. It's great that we do this. But the priority really is for the action so that the victims, especially the women who bear the brunt of such, of such tragedies, this is the one that we should prioritize. So immediate recommendation, as far as I'm concerned, take a look at the support for the Marawi Compensation Board. It is so grossly inadequate. I don't know if the amount that they provided, the compensation board, is enough to allow for the rehabilitation of 100 houses. You know, I look at the buildings that have been constructed. The stadium alone, the value of that infrastructure is probably enough to have compensated for the building of 100 houses. So why a stadium and not 100 homes? So I think this is something that we should be really looking at. Immediate response to the victims if you really want to say transitional justice is working in the Philippines.
I'll just build on to Amina's and my colleagues' position. One of the challenges that I think we need to recognize is the framework of accountability, because that is where Amina was going through. Because, in situations of war and armed conflict, you have both the state and non-state actors as human rights violators, right? So that recognition of accountability has to be written in bold letters in the transitional framework, because without accountability, we will not be able to sustain any transitional reconciliation for that matter. And we have to recognize that both state and non-state actors are human rights violators. They have perpetuated violence within the communities. And that is why Amina was saying why in situations of armed conflict, the response is not as immediate as in the situation of natural disasters. I'm a humanitarian advisor. I work with the United Nations Office for Humanitarian Affairs. We call that OCHA. And one of the things we did in a humanitarian response in situations of conflict is to set up a coordination mechanism, to respond to the humanitarian crisis of people displaced or people who are refugees. In the situation of natural disasters like earthquake and tsunami and floods, the response is immediate, while in armed conflict is long-term. So those are two different things. And both has within the framework of saving lives, right? But the armed conflict goes a long way, because of the sustained, protracted war, and we also call that the protracted humanitarian response, because the humanitarian response continues while the conflict also continues. While in a natural disaster, you need to respond immediately because of the immediate displacement due to natural disaster, and the humanitarians is immediate. Now, it is also true, as Amina was saying, that the response to the armed conflict is not as immediate and long-term. system. And this is where we should recognize the failure of the framing of transitional justice. And we have to be very honest about it, because a lot of words goes into that. And I think our colleagues who have worked on this, and as Benny was very well saying, what happened to the recommendations? Yeah. Now, this is where the challenges are, not only in our country, but in many other countries. Because you have to put again into the forefront the issue of accountability. And the state doesn't want to listen to that. Right? They don't want to say that you've been responsible. As I was saying in the beginning, the failure of the justice system to respond immediately to any massacres that happen in the communities is now being undertaken by the transitional justice framework. 50 years later, as in the case in Holo. And that is where we need to go back and say, let us institutionalize this issue. You have to memorialize, you have to institutionalize, and at the same time, reframe it so that the current availability of the transitional justice and reparation has to be expanded. It should not be limited. It should not only include between this period. Benny was talking of 100 years here, but what I'm saying is let us include all the way to the Holo period, because that includes the BARM, So we have to demand and rethink and redesign the transitional framework of reparation, compensation, and restitution that we have done. We need to redefine it. Just because the commissioners have already put forward, nothing is cut and dried or written in stone, because as we move along towards the recommendation, something new comes out, and we need to reassess that maybe we can move it forward better with a better funding for those that have been aggrieved and to those who are the beneficiaries of this transitional funding that is there. And as Amina was saying, let us critique. Why would you have a big, museum, or what was that, a building in Marawi when the rest of the people who have been affected doesn't even have houses yet? Something really went wrong in between there. And we cannot just say, okay, the building is there. No, we have to critique that and say, why did you put the building first instead of building houses for the people who lost so much during the conflict and continues to suffer today? So I think two things. We need to reassess the framing that we have done from the lessons that's being said here. And then at the same time, reposition, reposition a new framing that will account for the wrong that has been done, but at the same time to move forward for facilitating to those who are in need in terms of housing and those other framing of compensation.
Thank you, Ms. Sahor, for that. I'd like to bring in Dr. Mark. You have some thoughts about this aspect as well?
Yes, because I'm very, I'd like to bring the discussions to the intangibles of transitional justice. In reference to guarantee of non-recurrence of violence, we have been looking at, for example, with our students, the intergenerational dynamics of TJ. And that is what we have discovered so far is the phenomenon of intergenerational trauma, transgenerational trauma that frames even the attitudes and perceptions of our students towards transitional justice, towards BARM, towards Muslims, the Bangsamoro people, etc. What we have discovered so far, just like, for example, in Timor-Leste, the National Chega's report, they're saying that all of this they wanted to integrate into the curriculum. However, what we feel now is very important to address is really the intangibles as well. We don't have, no, there is a lack of programs for healing and reconciliation, so that the grievances are still there. We also see the important impact of storytelling. Parents, particularly mothers, who tell stories of what happened in the past, of their experiences. And this secondary trauma, the way their children absorbs this trauma, will still be able to see how this would shape their perceptions of the other. And I think this is where education comes in very important, especially not only the formal education, but also the non-formal, because universities are also involved in spaces through extension activities. Um, the way we see it is that, for example, in Lanao del Norte, most of the children of those who experienced wars in the past, in many instances, the parents would have loss of parental warmth, and this loss of parental warmth is in the absence of storytelling coming from the parents would also impact their healing and reconciliation program. So I think apart from the infrastructures, we have to look at as well the intangibles, no feelings, the grievances, and all of these emotions coming from our history. Um, in the light of the discussions of women and transitional justice, even in our telling of history in transitional justice, not much focus is given towards women who have participated in the history of protracted conflict in Lanao, in Maguindanao. That's why there are efforts as well to come up with materials for Bangsamoro, her story, so that we also would be able to hear about and appreciate the contributions of women in this protracted conflict. I think that's all coming from.
Thank you so much, Dr. Mark, for that. I'd like to perhaps circle back to what Amina was sharing, and also Dr. Sahor. We talk about the failure of following up on the recommendations on this framework of accountability, and then of course on the question on financing, and what do we really look at when it comes to financing and responding to these things. I'd like to bring you in, Ms. Payarco, because with the Addis Ababa action on sustainable financing, perhaps in the context of this new UN framework that you just signed of cooperation with the Philippines, is there a semblance of this as well, moving towards responding a bit better, a bit more effectively, to these causes as well?
In terms of supporting that, the framework for support, it's going to be through the peace processes and the signed peace agreements. Although at the moment, there are several efforts to also update the existing plans. For example, in the context of Marawi, there is a plan to update the post-conflict needs assessment to also re-examine also what needs to be prioritized again, since also as mentioned earlier in terms of the houses, since one of the challenges towards the granting of the compensation for the houses is also the multiple claimants. So it's also one of the bottlenecks way back. In fact, there are also some land titles that encompass the Lanao Lake. So imagine when you put already when you plot the lot, the titles, there are some intricacies that are yet to also be firmed up before the government can actually release the funds as well. So also, I think at the moment, there are efforts to also continuously support of course, through the comprehensive agreement on the Bangsamoro, there are also other funding resources like the block grant. And I think that's really also up to the regional government to also ensure that they adequately allocate the funds, because they are now at the forefront of governance. So it's also part of the responsibility of the local government to ensure that there's adequate allocation for this TJ efforts. So while there are a lot of international organizations, not only of course the UN, but other bilateral organizations that also support the peace processes, at the end of the day, of course, we'll go back again to the accountability as raised earlier, who will be the responsible entities to ensure that these are part and parcel of the plans. Especially at the moment, we are now about to embark on the elections, and it's going to be a new dynamic when we go to the regional elections, let alone the national elections. Also, I want to add to what Mark has mentioned and Prof. Benno earlier. In the community level, how do we make the TJ relatable to communities? Ano yung mukha ng transitional justice in a community? What is the face of transitional justice in areas that have low literacy rate? Of course, Ma'am Amina is very well versed na Magbasa Kita Foundation because before when we go to peace conversations in the communities, that's also one of the questions. So if you ask them, what is transitional justice for you? To a mother, to a young child who is not able to study. For example, in Marawi, the definition of transitional justice is going back to our houses. So how do we ensure that we can go back to our houses, but at the same time being able to resolve the land title, since there are some properties that have 5 claimants. So how do we also resolve that? And also, I think in terms of looking at the documentation process, since we need to also maximize the available technology at the moment, how do we make these messages across areas that have no access to accurate and reliable information? Because this information is also one of the things that arises conflict when you are in the communities. So some people would say that they were not compensated, but if there are also proper channels to inform them that there are ways to also compensate, but they also need to process certain documents and also ensure that they have the necessary platforms where they can access this. Since, again, going back to the accountability for some areas that they don't feel that the government presence is there, who will be their representatives towards the asserting that they have this claims that they can actually go to their existing local government institutions as well.
Thank you. Yes, please. But while Dr. Venetian answers this question or give the recommendations, we also would like to open this up to questions and suggestions also from the room. So anyone who would like to also, you are all part of the discussion, so please go ahead. And if there is anybody who's joining us online who also would like to ask a question, I request also the organizers to just give me a slip of paper so that I can read it as well. Please, Dr. Venetian.
Thank you very much, Madam. Siguro just picking up on the accountability framework, there has to be also a continuous reflection. We had the reparations law, and the reparations law essentially, as I've said, created a reparations board and created the memorialization commission. The reparations board is already done. I mentioned a while ago, imagine 75,000 claimants, the ones who only got the claims, 11,103. How many are those who actually came from the Bangsamoro? There is a town called Palimbang. And it has been given coverage already for quite some time. When the massacre happened, because there was the presence of the MNLF in the area, and what the Armed Forces of the Philippines was saying was that it was a legitimate military operation. The legitimate military operation supposedly actually killed men, sexual violence and slavery of women. They were taken aboard a naval boat, and you have also the death of children because of hunger, etc., etc. This happened in 1974, same year as Holo. What happened to them was that they actually, the claimants were 1,500. It happened to a community. So the reparations essentially should also be given to the number of people who were affected. Unfortunately, because of testimonies, affidavits, etc., that the claims board actually needed, only 27 of the same massacre, of the same violent incident, were given reparations. Imagine that. And what already, and this 27 claimants who got their reparation, they're also fighting already in the community. Why did they get reparation and why didn't we get reparation? So that's one faction. The second faction is from the claimants themselves. How come they got 1 million and I only got 100,000? Okay? And then you would have people saying, because the reparation system is a point system, the more atrocious your experiences, the higher the points. Okay? So how come that you gave 10 points when to that family, when my own family also were killed, but I only got 3 points? And then you have the owner of the mosque, the Takbil Mosque, who continuously is also claiming something because, it happened in the killings actually happened in the mosque. There was no systematic reflection in terms of the reparations program itself. So if you even in the case of Marawi, you have a different priority in terms of creating infrastructure. The actual reparations program that we had nationally also did not have the benefit of a reflection. And of all of those things that actually happened, you actually look at the data that most of those who actually claimed, 60% were men and only 40% were women. But women were very much part of that experience. So how come that this data is only generating that? So it's not only the framework of accountability, but also a continuous reflection on what we already had and what we could actually do better.
Please, thank you.
Just to build on to what Benny really said, which is really important. Now the reparation is a cost of conflict, yeah? Yes. As in the case that she has very well defined. So it started with a conflict. Many, many years later, we are going into some kind of, reparation and atonement in some sort of way. The process of that, as Benny very well described, was not in the context of what should be, yeah? Because other people were denied who were equally victims and survivors of that conflict. So what happens? There arises a new conflict, yeah? As you described. Now, this is where the tragedy comes in vis-a-vis transitional justice. Let's face it, yeah? Because it's not, we're not sliding on marbles because we have transitional justice now. As a matter of fact, there's a lot of landmines along the way because of the fact that much as there is a recognition of the crimes and the violence and the massacres during the period of armed conflict, yeah, both by state and non-state actors, and that has to really to be stated because both of them violated human rights, egregious crime. And those crimes has to be interrelated to international law, to humanitarian law, as well as the Geneva Protocol too. Now, when you contextualize it in that context, you mentioned about what is really compensation, right? What does compensation means to the Marawi people? And it is really true. They are not going to say, oh, this happened. It's not just about the writing of the history, what happened in the past. Compensation is structure. It's real. They can feel it, they can touch it, which is a house. Yeah. That's what they want. That's what for them is healing. That is for them that they have a place that was ruined and they can enter back into. And this is why the difference between responding and reparation in situations of war and armed conflict vis-a-vis the natural disasters. Because in the natural disasters, we build houses, build back better. That's the call for natural disasters. But when it comes to the armed conflict, the mobilization is much lower because it is very much politicized. And I think that is where the problem arises.
Thank you. Yes, please, I mean.
The other thing I think that we have to really recognize is the mindset of national government, national leaders. In the case of rehabilitating tsunami victims, if they are in the areas of the majority, it's so easy for them to say, yes, we have to attend to this immediately. But if it's in the area of Muslims and indigenous peoples, you don't have that same sense of urgency. I'm afraid that, especially now, when you have all of these negative ideas again floating about Islam, that Islamophobia is again on the rise. And we have to make sure that those in government who are responsible for addressing issues of armed conflict, preventing the incursion of violent extremist thoughts into our communities, that they be aware of their own mindset. I mean, certainly you cannot have a Philippine ambassador talking about, you know, kill all the Palestinian children because they're Muslims and they're going to become what? Suicide bombers? I mean, for crying out loud, you're representing the Philippine government. How can you say something like that without thinking about how it affects those who have experienced something similar to what's going on in Gaza? When I first heard that, for instance, everything came back to my mind about what happened in Holo, where our home was gone. I had cousins who were killed, and that trauma never leaves you. So when you're talking about mindset of a national government, for instance, and you're talking about transitional justice, sometimes it's as simple as listening to the victims and remembering, internalizing what the victims are telling you. And it's not like we just told them yesterday. This has been what, 50 years of telling national government what's going on, what the truth is, and what we need. And talking about mindset, the response, for instance, in providing livelihood assistance for the Marawi victims, it came quickly enough. But this is what I mean by mindset. So the women were given livelihood packages. Now remember, they are all clustered, thousands of them, in IDP camps. And here you come giving them livelihood assistance, and you're giving them sewing machines and packages so that they can learn how to make noodles and soap. For goodness sake, that's a lot of money for that kind of livelihood intervention. Where do you think they're going to make those products, and who's going to buy it? Their fellow IDPs? So sometimes mindset is important. Listen to what the victims are saying, what they need. Because sometimes it doesn't take big bucks to be able to make the victim feel that you're doing something. And to me, you were talking about how do the communities feel transitional justice. To me, it would show them that my government cares, they know what I need, they're doing what they can. That is transitional justice for the community members.
Thank you so much. I'd like to stay in this on this point and ask you about, because we have a mechanism, in government with the GAA on gender responsive planning and budgeting. So I want to ask you about this in the context of our discussion today, especially in BARM. Perhaps any one of you, has this been used, and perhaps I can start with Attorney Malang, because you were part of the DILG. Are there best practices, or how can we improve the use of the gender budget, especially when it comes to women, peace, and security, and of course making sure that all these things are gender inclusive in governance and political participation as well?
Yes, of course. During our time in ARMN, we have that GAD programs and plans, and we allocated budget for that. But the most important thing in the local government at that time is how to make the local government functional. Some of the injustices were committed because some of our LGUs are not functional. So we have that program, local government functionality assessment. But I'd like to go back with the mindset, as what Amina have mentioned, the mindset of our political, government officials. Perhaps one of the reasons why they have that kind of mindset is because of the way they were brought up with in our history. So the most important thing now, as a Bangsamoro, we've been a victim of this conflict, and still we also a victim of our history books. So one thing, I don't know if it is a historical injustice, but even I do believe President Duterte before recognized that there were mistakes on the way we narrate our history. So for instance, I think we have to rewrite our history so that the children or the youth of the Luzon and Visayas especially could understand who are the Moro people. Who are these people? Are they just like the way they were described before, that these people have buntot in when you discuss tomorrow in Manila? So I do hope some things will be done also on our history book. So I think those are the things that we have to reconsider so that the past is the past, but we have to make sure that our history will be corrected. What are the roles of the Moro people in the Philippines history? Are they real Filipinos now? Or what is the idea of the people of Luzon and Visayas about our Moro brothers? So I do hope that history books will be rewritten again so that it would conform to what is the real history of the Philippines, and especially with the Moro people. Thank you, po.
Thank you. Two things to respond here, and we'd like to again invite the audience. So we have a question on mindsets. So if you have suggestions or recommendations on that, and also my question on the GAD budget, the use of the GAD budget. Anyone from the room? Anyone who would like to share something? Otherwise, go back to the panel, please, Ms. Palyarco. Oh, please. Secretary Ging, sorry.
Okay.
Ayan po.
Yeah, I wanted to respond to several things. So, the first question, what happened to the recommendations? Actually, not all governments are walang pake, no? I mean, I'd like to say that we took that commission report very seriously. In fact, I'd like to correct one of the stories about why there was no national Transitional Justice Commission that was instituted under Pinoy. He actually was ready to sign an executive order, but he was told it couldn't be independent if it was done by executive order. The president could not create a body that was independent of him. It needed to go to law. So it wasn't that we ran out of time or what, or that he didn't want to. He was willing to do it, but he was told it's not going to be the independent body that you need a transitional justice to be. We did actually do some work already on some of the recommendations, and I gave a report on that submitted to the executive secretary. Of course, the next administration, after saying that the transition between us would be seamless, never called us to ask anything. But for one, well, I had said this before, and I think some people had asked for it. We even have a knowledge product of a sample syllabus for grade 4, I think, that would teach Bangsamoro history. Yeah, we had started working with DepEd. ARM, we spoke with the ARM government about the land conflict issues. We did quite a bit of work on land conflicts because we knew that that was going to be a continuing conflict situation that was not going to be resolved by CAB. Anyway, just to put that there. which is related to the second point about, well, someone has to be accountable. And we have to call out the elephant in the room. It is political. Accountability is political. We're talking about the Marawi as one of the TJables. And mainly we're talking about now the problem of compensation. But the problem of truth-telling has not even been done. And that was the first thing that the Marawi people asked for. The Maranao asked for, why did it happen? Why did a small band of, sabihin ng terrorists, lead to a 5-month devastation of a vibrant city? Why was it never talked about? That's political, because it leads to the highest political leader, the one who challenged Maute to come to Marawi and I will be here. But he wasn't there. He was in Russia at that time. How to do transitional justice under a presidency that was creating another TJable table completely under his watch. The TJable table of EJKs, where the international court is now saying we have to go after him. And now, under this present administration, we need, sabi yun eh, a national transitional justice body has to be created by law by the National Congress if you want it to be national. Because a regional TJ body is not going to be able to handle, for example, the issues of how do you teach Bangsamoro history to a national to a national citizenry. Hindi lang naman yan, it has to be National Congress. Will that law get passed under this administration? It's very political. And how do you work? So if it's political, constituencies are going to be important. Some political leaderships do respond to public opinion. I think we've been seeing that just very recently with what's been happening with Maharlika Investment Fund, for example. But it's not going to respond to anything that doesn't have a constituency. Transitional justice the discourse has to go beyond rooms like this, the usual suspects. I think some of us have over-talked, have done over-talking on transitional justice discourse. I had said then at that body, the important thing is to begin to plan how do you make it a national public discourse. Kasi kung tayo-tayo lang, yung mga political decisions that will have to be made, the political will that we are looking for is not going to come in the competition of what the political leadership is going to respond to. We will fall through. This will continue to fall through the cracks. And it doesn't have to be called transitional justice. I think the worst thing is when to go to community and say, what does transitional justice mean? Hindi nga yan, ayun, kuminsan when we begin to have the label, it becomes to be so easy to just shoot everything there. And then and then the converted choir takes over it and becomes very excellent in the discourse. And those who also need to talk about it don't know. Ang hirap talaga ng transitional justice. Transition pa lang, hindi mo mga maano eh. Kailangan mong i-explain eh. Maybe we have to find some other ways of talking about it. Okay, just some very quick things. Marawi, Inside Gov did a study before the end of the administration on what was the state of rehabilitation funds, which includes some tracking of the displacement that happened, where they are, because that's the thing. Some of those that are going to be compensated are no longer in Marawi. The Maranaos are now even more dispersed than ever, and I think what has happened is they have become a subgroup of poverty in Metro Manila, in Quiapo, for example. At the same time that they have become a subgroup, a hidden group, in displacement, because they are no longer being counted in Marawi either. Importanteng makita yan while it is still quote-unquote fresh, it is just 7 years, 8 years as compared to the others that are going to be harder to draw from. So, yeah, that constituency, it needs to be grown by claiming that narrative that is not my own as my own. Storytelling is so important. When we first started, when I was with GZO, we did the memory truth telling on the Marcos dictatorship. And and I'm just giving this as an example, one of the things that we started to do then was to have seasons of remembering. January 25, which was, well, EDSA DOS, now so questionable, no? But January 25 to February 25, a season of remembering. August 21 to September 21, another season of remembering. And we were saying, do memorialization activities. Gather your family, tell your children about your stories. We did, for example, the memorialization in one fishing village that had suffered some and we put up a marker there. The community came together, told a story, and we put up a marker. It's the first step, that recognition that something had happened that has wounded me and must be remembered. And it is so important because I think Filipinos don't like to look back. Pagka natapos na yung problema, yung move on. Yung move on. Kasi ako, I cry when I read about the stories of what we were like before World War II, before the bombing of Manila. I mean, we weren't Pearl of the Orient because of the Christianity. Manila was the small parish of And what happened? And we didn't get sufficient compensation. Japan got much more compensation than us in World War II. And yet so many don't know that. And it's patong na lang ng moving on natin. So finally, many TJables, I think it's going to be hard if every discourse brings all the TJables in. Kasi iba-iba na eh. And what you can do, what is the complexity of that particular table, really needs to be threshed out and needs to be sustained. Baka kailangan merong may constituency building campaign around each TJable and measure it next year. Is our TJable narrative a little bit more known beyond the circle that had started it out with? It's women, the transitional justice, it has to be an emotional issue. Otherwise, it is something that is just going to go into a report. And it is just going to be something filed, and it's going to be for the scholars to look at when they need it. That's why it needs to be led by women. And let's be as emotional about it as we need to be, because the wounds are not going to heal unless the emotions are also brought out and healed.
Thank you so much for that, Secretary. That is a lot of suggestions, and I love the way that you frame it, you know, about the seasons of remembering, and most especially about this being an emotional issue. Sometimes it's misunderstood that if it's an emotional issue, it depicts weaknesses when it should be a strength. So well heard, and I think our panelists are also starting to think about other ways, you know, to get this information further. You have a special message for me. Okay, so this is a question from online. Okay, question from our online participants for anyone in the panel to answer. Given the role of the state in the trauma, damage, and destruction in BARM, the national government has the primary responsibility in implementing TJR, but in consultation with the victims and their leaders. Wouldn't focusing on the role of the BARM government by shifting the responsibility away from the national government? I think we needed to distinguish the different roles of the state, victims, and their representations in TJR without expecting victims to compensate themselves. So this is from the UN Peace and Development Advisor. Any thoughts, please? Okay. So, Attorney Anwar, do you have any thoughts on this question?
Well, it is agreed that all of us have a role. For instance, the BARM government have a role on the transitional justice, as well as the national government. But we have to understand that the peace process is not yet over. Remember, there should be an exit agreement after all these things by the government and the MILF, who are now the BARM government. I mean, they are now in the BARM government. So the role of the national government is, of course, different. Their accountability is different from that of the role of the farm people. The most important thing now is how to, in a way, make the Bangsamoro ordinary people understand and feel that they are now back to normalization. Normalization of their livelihood, normalization of their lives in the countryside, though the trauma is still there, but at least little by little, there should be, in a way, a feeling of reparation towards our people. And this should be done by the national government as well as by the BTA. How do they do that with the ordinary Bangsamoro people? So ito siguro yung dapat na importanteng gawin with the normalization program of the national government and the MILF. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Yes, please, Amina.
Well, definitely, I agree with that 100%. I mean, don't expect the victims and the representative of the victims to be the ones responsible for rehabilitating and compensating victims, because you're all victims. What is the accountability of state is dominant here. Now, in the case of Marawi, for instance, when they started putting together the Marawi task force, I was really quite surprised when it was just all government, national government agencies, and there wasn't that much of a role for the regional governor of the Autonomous Region of Muslim Mindanao. I mean, they should have been co-chair or vice chair of the task force because they could provide immediate inputs. There wasn't also that much of a role for the local government. I mean, I don't think that the mayor of Marawi City had a leading role in the task force. Now, why is that? Is it because national government knows everything and they don't need to know what the victim needs? And it was only later that they included the regional government of ARM. Now, they're saying the BARM regional government should be the one really taking the lead in the rehabilitation of Marawi. Excuse me? That doesn't seem to make sense when for so many years, National Government Task Force was giving all these reports about the status of rehabilitation, and now, 6 years after, you expect the BARM regional government to sort of, carry more of a burden. That doesn't make sense. So if you're talking about accountability, and I'm really glad that question came online, national government has to very, very clearly take on the responsibility of addressing the needs of the victims if transitional justice is going to be truly operationalized.
Thank you for that. Yes, please, Dr. Vedeshwan. I'm good. Okay.
Yeah, I think we cannot just say that we pass this on to the Bangsamoro and that the national government is not participatory. It always has to be both. And as Amina was saying, there was a mistake of the start, yeah, because the group was very military oriented and did not involve the local people like the mayor of Marawi and all of that. So, we're facing facts here. But now that the process is rolling out, I think it's very important that the national and the Bangsamoro would come together and make sure that it is really viable in its implementation. Because as we were saying, as we are talking here, there's a recognition of what is lacking, and there's a recognition that we need to reassess again what level of implementation that we can and could proceed. But I would have to say that the barn or the Bangsamoro would have to take on the lead on this, because the government, the national government may drag its feet towards, going through this process. So, you have to take the lead on this and say, okay, let's do it this way. How can we work on this? So, it is always a two-way thing.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that. There is a comment here, a suggestion from the UNHCR, and just read this, unless she wants to take the floor? No? Okay, so I'll just read it for you. Okay, in view of the need to have a better framework to ensure state accountability on transitional justice towards the most vulnerable, there is a need to ensure a right-based legislation that puts those vulnerable sectors at the core. We hope that the academe and PCID will be an advocate as well on the passage of the IDP bill, where measures to attain TJ will be embedded. I hope that similar a similar forum may be organized as well on this.
Yeah, that's a good idea. No,
Very good idea.
Yeah, I was going to say that following what Secretary Deles has mentioned, there were actually bills filed in Congress to create also the National Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Commission for the Bangsamoro. In the case of the first filing of Congressman Kit Belmonte, it actually already passed the committee level. But then their term ended. So they've refiled it the following Congress, but that only got one meeting at the committee level. And it didn't, after how many years, wala. In the case of Senator Ontiveros, ganun din. It didn't really make it out of its way in the committee level. So in other words, yes, I agree. Transitional justice is political, and if you have legislators not really understanding and supporting it as well, it will also not become a law. There is also a a suggestion to expand the reparations law that we have. Kasi the reparations law only has a particular time frame. It was only martial law period. And so 1972 to 1982 yata, I'm not sure. So basta may time frame siya. So ngayon, there is also a call, at least among TJ advocates, to expand that time frame because a lot of atrocities also happened prior to the declaration of martial law, in fact. And then there are also current TJables that are also possible. Right. And let me just raise that we have a law against genocide, crimes against humanity, and other violations of international humanitarian law, but we're not actually using it. The only case that was decided was actually in Marawi, with regard to one of the non-state actors that was charged with crimes against humanity, including rape and sexual violence against the young girl that was abducted and then was forcibly married to him. That was the only case under this particular Republic Act, and we did not use it with regard to the EJ case, the drug war related killings. We have not used it in any other situation. So that is something that we can use, but we're not.
Thank you. Dr. Mark, you have something to add, please?
Yes, sorry. I was just also trying to look at ground experience. So, for example, in Lanao del Norte, there have been efforts at the local level to help sustain the gains of the peace process by supporting the camp's transformation of Bilal, one of the 6 recognized MILF camps. Now, the context is that we're in Lanao del Norte. We have 6 municipalities outside of Barm. There have been interventions, and we've seen that most of these socio-economic packages are in a form of agricultural interventions. So, for example, abaca, farms, etc. Um, we have just concluded a 3-day workshop on environmental peace building because we now see how climate change, for example, the associated phenomenon, like for example, spread of diseases and pests and diseases of plants could undermine government's effort to help support comes transformation. In the case of abaca, we have known that some of these abacas form of interventions to MLF communities have succumbed to the Banchatab virus. And this is very important because we see this climate change impacts undermining political legitimacy. So now, for example, the communities would be frustrated because of the issues with the yield of the abaca that were given to them. I think also very important lesson or insights from our 3-day workshops on environmental peace building is how do we see efforts for socio-economic packages being undermined by climate security issues, because we know that so far different levels of hierarchy of governments, there have been efforts to help support MILF communities, but now are being undermined by climate security issues like flooding, spread of diseases, and etc. I think that's all.
For that, I'd like to bring in one question, and perhaps as we are running out of time, perhaps our panelists can use this as also your closing remarks. Many things have been said about our gaps, but also some glimmers of hope moving forward. What can you suggest? In what ways can transitional justice mechanisms be made more inclusive, be made more gender sensitive, and as to the point of Amina as well, more responsive to the real needs also of the communities and of the people, to address the needs and experiences, most especially, of course, of women in conflict-affected areas? We start with you, perhaps, Vanessa?
Okay. May I also just quickly respond to the earlier question you
Please.
mentioned on the utilization of GAD budget?
Please,
So
thank you.
in 2014, there is actually a joint memorandum during the time of SECGING between the Philippine Commission on Women and the Office of the Presidential Advisor on the Peace Process with respect to the utilization of the GAD funds for WPS interventions. So it's actually one of the models that is available because the Philippines is the only country that utilizes the GAD fund for the WPS efforts. But of course, as the common issue prevail, it's in the implementation, in the actual implementation, that's one of the challenges. But it's good to note that apart from the existing GAD fund, the other entry points that we can now look into are the available resources. For example, the DILG has recently issued the circular on the crafting of the local plans, the POPs plan, they call that, the Peace and Order Public Safety Plan, where it also touches upon the GAD and the WPS as part of the initiatives to also strengthen the efforts in engaging the women, the young women, and intersectionalities in the peace and security concerns of the area. Similarly, of course, it's still ongoing. The localization of the NTFL CAC. Of course, that's lengthier issue if we open that. But there are also efforts at the provincial level led by the local government, peace and order councils. And also, I think at the moment, the National Action Plan on Preventing Countering Violent Extremism is being updated. So this one is being led by the DILG and also supported by other international and local organizations. And part and parcel of that plan is also strengthening the role of the women and the young women in pushing for the prevention component of the violent extremism narratives. So I think there are also windows where these plans can be harmonized. Even at the ASEAN level, the ASEAN Regional Plan of Action protection pillar has specifically mentioned transitional justice as part of the priority action points that must be taken into consideration. Of course, not only in the Philippine context, but at the regional level as well. So
Thank you.
I think that's there are glimmers of hope that we can look into. But again, as Sekging mentioned earlier, it's also a matter of building the constituencies who can really support this advocacy. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that. Perhaps I'll accommodate first our virtual panelist, perhaps Attorney Malang. We can have you for your answer to this question.
Yeah, actually, I have only two recommendations. Number one is to pass the TJ law, and then second, to acknowledge the historical injustice by rewriting our history. For instance, a history book that will tell who are the Bangsamoro people. Second, what are the roles or the role of the Bangsamoro people in our national history? Why is it that there is a non-national hero that belongs to the Bangsamoro? So those two things are very important. And third is perhaps we can try to reconsider the issue of land in the Bangsamoro areas, especially on the issue of reparation of those who are dispossessed with their lands because of their conflict. So I do believe that this should be discussed thoroughly by the GPH and the MILF, because that is still the conflicts on the ground. I'm in Maguindanao, and still some of the conflicts, or most of the conflicts, are basically because of the conflict on land. And it's not only between Moro and non-Moro, but sometimes it's between the Moro and the Moro people. So those are the three things that I'd like. I mean, the possible way wherein we can have a transitional justice in our midst. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Dr. Mark, please. I think is he still there?
One
Yes, please.
of the academic I'd like to talk about the role of the academe in this entire spectrum of transitional justice. Um, we are now working towards trying to lessen the gap between theory and practice, and in the discussions with regards to transitional justice and how this could be integrated into the curriculum. We've always believed that it is very important to bring in practitioners into the teaching of TJ and peace education in the academic community. The relationship between HAIs and grassroots movements, human rights defenders, peace advocates are mostly in the aspect of research and extension only. We see this very relevant because, when we talk about peace education, especially in the topics of transitional justice, we see how knowledge is out there, to grassroots communities, grassroots leadership to bring this and harvest these experiences and bring into the curriculum. That's very important. Number two is that for the based on our observations in many of the universities and state colleges, you have a separate curriculum for peace studies and gender studies. Seldom do we see them integrated into one field of study. So this is something very important because we also see how transitional justice and peace education would benefit from discussions about the role and participation of women. Thirdly, is that I think in crafting the curriculum for women, peace, and security is very important to generate information to come up with learning materials on Bangsamoro, her story, because women are usually invisible when we talk about history, especially with the history of reproductive conflict in the BARM, and they are usually portrayed as victims to the conflict. So this is very important. Um, with regards to education, especially with the MLF combatants, we see them like the BWAB, the members of the Bangsamoro Islamic Women Auxiliary Brigade. We see the importance of education, and access to education is still an issue pre and post conflict times. However, in many institutions or academic institutions, we see that this is not being considered. No, conflict created huge gaps in affected communities, especially in Lanao, the 6 municipalities of Lanao, including former combatants. We see the role of education. How can we then offer academic programs so that these former combatants can also be productive by having their own degree. So something which is very important. With regards to education, we're now trying to look at how we can teach history or her story by trying to assess language or media of instruction because we know the relationships between emotions and visual history, how to process this one so that we would be guaranteed of non-recurrence of violence, so that the teaching of Bangsamoro history or her story would not reopen wounds, but very importantly also promote healing and reconciliation. We also, lastly, I'd like to also suggest that there should be a peace and gender audit as to education. For example, how we can then
Dr. Mark, yeah, can you repeat again? We can't hear you now, it seems.
can you hear me?
Faintly. So while you're fixing your audio, we miss you for some seconds in between, and I'm afraid. Okay, so well, these things happen, of course, thanks to technology. We love it, we hate it, can't live without it. But before our other panelists answer also the question, there is an important question that's being inserted by one of the members of the audience that I hope you can accommodate. It's a question on how you distinguish between TJR and peace building and other issues which are important and urgent. But the question is, if we expand the scope of TJR too much, isn't there a danger of diluting it or overloading it? And this is from the UN Peace and Development Advisor, Melina Nathan. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Well, I'll actually let Inday Sahor take the on because I'm inviting you to listen to She Talks Peace podcast. I have a two-part discussion with Inday Sahor, and she talks about that a lot. If I may just say one phrase from our discussion, there can be no peace without justice. So that sort of answers that, that particular question. But before we end the conversation, I just wanted to stress the fact that if you're talking about transitional justice in the Philippines, don't just talk about what's happening in the Bangsamoro region.
Absolutely.
Talk about what's happening in the indigenous peoples areas of Mindanao and nationwide. Because we did have a peace process with the CPP, NPA, NDF, on again, off again. Right now, it's off again. But the situation of the communities that were also impacted as much as we in the Bangsamoro areas were impacted, it's there. It's it's growing. The frustration, the anger is growing. So you were talking about truth telling, not just for us, but for everyone who had been affected by state militaristic action. There is a move. We're talking about memorializing and truth-telling. There is a move, and funds are already, I think, under the management of CHR, to create the museum so that we can remember. And I know that with the Commission on Human Rights, they had done so many interviews, and they have a storehouse of the stories of all of the victims. So we do have it. What do we do with it? And what do we, ordinary citizens, what can we do to ensure that our state does support the truth-telling part? Because truly, you cannot have rehabilitation if there is no forgiveness. And you cannot have a forgiveness if only one side is saying, hey, this happened, but the other side does not acknowledge that it happened at all.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that, Amina.
Well, as for me, just a very, very specific thing that I'd like to say. You cannot actually have peace also without women.
Absolutely.
That's the entire thing. When it was time of Secretary Deles, this in OPAP, this was very, very pronounced. Unfortunately, right now, OPAP Pro only has one woman in its executive board, or its executive slot of officers. There has to be that thinking, internalized thinking, that women is actually at the center of all of these things. So when you're talking about inclusion, it should be already automatic. It's not something that we should, we should still ask for. We still fight for it, of course. But then, why? It's not the norm yet. So we have to reach that point that the inclusion of women in any space, whether it is a transitional justice body, when you have that National Transitional Justice and Reconciliation Board, how many women will be there? If you're talking about international humanitarian law violation, how many women judges do we have that could basically assist us in the adjudication, for example, of sexual and gender-based violence that happens in conflict situations and all of those things. I mean, let us make sure that it is not just a rhetoric, that we just continually saying that the women should be there, but it should already be the norm. Right. Otherwise, it would still be something that would be also challenge and question. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. I think I just build on to what, my friends and colleagues were saying here, because, one of the things that we are talking about here in the transitional framework is that we are looking at the role really of the women, yeah? But at the same time, let us also study the principles behind these roles. I was talking with Amina last week in the She Talk about women, peace, and security. And I think we need to examine again what women, peace, and security framework has done for us, yeah? Really, really. I mean, I was I was facilitating yesterday a webinar online for Arab women because we were talking about Palestine. And actually, the women from Palestine, from the West Bank, was in the webinar. And they have been working on women, peace, and security. And they said, having framed their work on women, peace, and security did not do anything for them. Did not do anything for the women in Iraq. And I was in Iraq. I lived there for 1 year. And for the other countries. Why is this so? And I want to relate it a bit to transitional justice. Why is this so? Because the framing, the fundamental framing of women, peace, and security is bringing women from the kitchen table to the negotiating table. It doesn't work like that. Because as we all know, before there is armed conflict, before there is war, there's a humanitarian crisis. And women are not involved in the humanitarian crisis. And this is a challenge for the United Nations. I work with the UN, and this challenge the UN has to reframe. Because the framing of women, peace, and security, which includes protection and participation, our focus has always been within the framework of protection, which in the process looks at women as victims and survivors. And we frame it under the GBV, the gender-based violence. Right. And because of that framing, the whole framework of women, peace, and security is focused on protection, which makes women victims and survivors of the time. But what women need is participation. Participation, which means in the leadership. And this is what Amina and Benny was saying, where are the women into the process? So we have to reshift the principle of the framing of protection itself. Because I know, I've done protection myself, but the protection is always in support of what the victims and survivors of sexual violence in conflict. But you are not putting them into the framework of leadership and into the response, whether it is a humanitarian action or whether it is a response to the emergency. The women are not there. Our view of the women in situations of armed conflict are victims and survivors of rape and sexual violence. Where is the leadership when actually the women have always been exercising leadership at all levels during the conflict, during the emergency humanitarian crisis, during the onset of the emergency, and all the way towards the settlement. And so we need to reevaluate why women are not in the participation framework, which we had been doing. I think my colleague in UNHCR will agree to that because UNHCR is taking the lead on protection within the UN. But we have to reframe protection within the context of women's participation in the protection itself, but not as a victim and survivor that has to be always in the back burner. Always not in the leadership position because we tend to patronize women that way. And we have to cut that off and not patronize women in this context. So just to end this, Gwen, I would just like to say, let us redesign our own concept of women, peace, and security. Let us redesign transitional justice. Let's redesign compensation, reparation, restitution, and atonement. I think Secretary Delius will agree with me. Okay, thank you.
Thank you so much. What a pleasure to have moderated this session. We thank Ms. Inday Sahor, Dr. Maria Lourdes Veneracion, Dr. Mark Anthony Torres, Attorney Anwar Malang, Ms. Vanessa Palyarco, all of you here. Yes, last words, Dr. Mark. If you really have to say something. Yes, go ahead, please.
You can hear me po?
Yes.
Okay, so I was saying earlier the importance of the creative arts, constituency building, especially talking to younger generations. When you talk about very complex issues like women, transitional justice, and the pursuit of peace, we now see the relevance of the arts, the performing arts, theater, in terms of how to connect to younger generations. Very complex topics like this are also, the absorptive capacity of younger generations to absorb this very complex topics now, very little, especially here in our universities here in Mindanao. Secondly is I think we need to be very practical in how we increase constituency. For example, MSU Maguindanao, MSU General Santos, MSU IIT is talking about immersive approaches in terms of how to increase appreciation for these very complex concepts. So I, I think that's all. Thank you. Thank you
Thank you,
very
Dr.
much.
Mark. So again, please let us all give a hand to our panelists, Attorney Anwar Malang, Dr. Mark Anthony Torres, Dr. Maria Lourdes Veneracion, Ms. Inday Sahor, Ms. Vanessa Palyarco, and of course, Ms. Amina Rasul. It has been a pleasure to moderate this session. Just, isa pa pala talaga. This is a good problem to have. Please.
I was one of the transitional justice facilitator and our boss is here. Narinig ko lang yung mga women in security, etc., etc. And the women's participation, kung ano man yung dapat na gagawin. Take note, from the very start, in fact, in July 27, I told them, inano ko sa aking Facebook ang mga things to do. Kasama doon yung transitional justice. And I told them that, first things first, do the TGRC because that is your commitment. Diba? Nandoon yung mga peace dividends. So sasabihin natin, wala bang kababaihan? Ang dami po. In fact, from the BTA, most of my members from the Young Professionals Network, na kababaihan nandoon. And I was so saddened. Ako naman ayoko nangingialam pagka, pag ganyang klaseng mga usapan because I want them to be an independent decision maker. Pero mantakin mo 3 years silang natulog. Sa akin, nakita ko rin naman ang kanila mga consultant, the way I am now, I am consulting for Islamic microcredit. Ang mga consultant din naman natin doon are the same guys who has been with us. And I think we would like to acknowledge Secretary Gindelis, Madam. Practically, you have done all the things that should have been done, except for the Mama Sapano. Nandoon din po ako sa hindi ko malaman kung bakit tayo magkaroon ng ending ng bloody, So, I was one of the speakers. Isang talagang ako, na one of the, yung namatay sa Mama Sapano are Muslim converts from CAR. And so I was invited for the, kasi isasama ako dapat sa Mama Sapano first anniversary. Sabi ko nga, it looks like we are being, parang pinaglalaban tayo, pinagsasawong tayo. Tama ba yun? Tapos nandoon pa yung kapatid. So, what they said is parang, kasalanan ba ng mga Moro? Yun mukhang kami ang biktima doon. Because there seems to be a prolonging of the war, prolonging of the agony. So, isang pasalamatan din natin si Madam Amina for taking time, for taking the cudgel of, it's high time that we have to establish a transitional justice commission. Or perhaps for a short period na maialurang natin lahat yung mga usapin. Kasi kung antayin natin yung BARM, malamang ay, the other day, 3 na po ang namatay sa, barangay election. Huwag na nating sa iba-ibang parang, I am so saddened. Kaya alam mo ako, ayokong umuwi doon. Salamat po.
Maraming salamat po. So there is passion.
Congratulations, girls.
Thank you. Thank you. There's passion, there's willingness, there's will, there's expertise. There's a lot of things for us to work on. So let's continue the discussion later on. But at this point, I'd like to give the room to our host as well. So thank you so much to our panelists.
Thank you. At this point, we'd just like to ask for some closing remarks, again, from Amina. Oo eh. Hindi, hindi ako. Sana si Salma, but, you know. Ikaw na mag-close.
We're extremely lucky to have this dynamic and vibrant women, including my older sister. Show your age. And I would like to thank all the participants who came here on site and for those who joined online. Sad to say, time flies when we're having fun. But we hope to gather again, all of you, maybe in November because it's going to be the Mindanao Month of Peace, right? So we can again revisit these troubling and nagging issues that beset BARM and the IP communities because they've always been relegated, right, in the discussions of issues that face our nation. We would like to thank our forever partner, the UP College of Law and the UP Institute for the Administration of Justice. Incidentally, it's the investiture of the Chancellor later this afternoon at 2 p.m. at UP Theater for those who want to join. So again, thank you so much, and thank you, Inday, Doc Vene, older sister, Vanessa, and our men who've been supporting, pushing for women's in BARM and the IP communities. Our favorite Dr. Mark Torres, our favorite human rights lawyer, now private sector, Attorney Anwar Malang. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wal barakatuh. Maraming salamat.
Thank you, Attorney Salma. Thank you, everyone, on behalf of IAJ and the College of Law. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you.